The air in the command module of the iron quill tasted thick and metallic, saturated with the residual ozone of overworked capacitors and the faint, stale scent of recycled human sweat. The odor of suppressed exertion clinging to the synth fiber uniforms. 3 seconds. That was the window Observer 7 had calculated before the Xylo's primary sensor net could register the kinetic shift of their approach. Commander Kalen Vane did not breathe during those 3 seconds. His knuckles, white against the aged plating of the tactical console, transmitted the only vibration allowed in the tight space. He ignored the polite, frantic looping queries from Zoraz Station echoing faintly through the hull plating, translated into a dozen dead Earth dialects. Unidentified vessels, this is Zoraz Station. You are in restricted space. State your intentions. Kalen's intent was not for discussion. It was etched into the scar tissue over his left eye, a permanent reminder of the last diplomatic mission where hope had been exchanged for annihilation. He could feel the familiar, unwelcome clench in his diaphragm, the physical manifestation of every failed treaty and misplaced trust. His entire command structure operated under the shadow of the Veliska Accords, or rather the Veliska Massacre, where eloquence had been answered with eradication. Observer 7, execute Cascade Sigma 09. Kalen rasped, the sound barely audible over the low thrum of the quill's maneuvering thrusters. The response was immediate, synthesized, and utterly devoid of hesitation. Cascade Sigma 09 initiated. Harmonic resonance targeting primary Xylo's communications spine. Estimated disruption, 0.04 seconds. Structural integrity breach probability, negligible. It was not a bomb they deployed. It was an inversion of logic. The human military doctrine, refined over a century of desperate conflict, understood that the enemy's greatest strength could become its most profound weakness. The Xylos, a civilization linked by the cerebral chorus, relied on perfect, instantaneous informational synergy. Kalen's plan was simple: sever the nervous system before the body could even comprehend the wound. On the main viewport, the massive geodesic dome of Zoraz Station hung, beautiful and oblivious. Then, the effect hit. It wasn't an explosion that shook the structure, but a sudden, internal collapse of frequency. The external view showed nothing, but the internal telemetry flared crimson for a microsecond before stabilizing at zero activity on all Xylo's broadcast channels. The ethereal light tendrils within the station dome dimmed fractionally, the ceremonial pulsing faltering into a confused stutter. Comms array neutralized, Observer 7 confirmed. External sensor calibration degrading. The chorus is attempting self-diagnosis, but the data flow loop is broken. Kalen felt a brief, grim satisfaction. The prelude was over. He watched the tactical display as the small, armored infiltration craft, designated Stingers, detached from the Quill's ventral bays. These were not the graceful, polished transports Earth's politicians had imagined sending. They were brutish, matte black wedges designed to punch through reinforced layers and deploy rapidly. They moved with a predatory silence toward maintenance access hatches that the Xylo's maintenance drones, still operating on pre-cascade parameters, ignored completely. Tavran Hollow reports secure insertion into Conduit Delta 3. Entering primary data junction now, came a filtered transmission from one of the Stinger teams. Hollow's voice, always too steady, betrayed nothing of the claustrophobia of threading himself through narrow service tunnels smelling strongly of hot metal and the alien equivalent of industrial grease. Kalen's orders were absolute, burned into the minds of every operative. Precision, speed, silence. The memory of Veliska, the optimistic ambassadors, silenced by plasma fire while they were still exchanging formal scrolls, was the fuel for this cold efficiency. Humanity had learned that reverence for protocol was a terminal condition. Inside the targeted communications hub, the infiltration team met their first resistance. 3 Xylos operators, their multifaceted eyes gleaming with an internal analytical light, recoiled from the sudden digital void. They were beings of pure data exchange, and the silence was physical agony. When the first human operative, a specialist in counter-topology, moved forward, the Xylos did not raise weaponry. They extended delicate, multi-jointed appendages in what Kalen's tactical overlay identified as a gesture of high-level appeal, their translator implants sputtering in confusion. The operative did not pause. He deployed specialized magnetic dampeners onto the control surfaces. There was no sound of shattering glass or kinetic impact, only a low, harmonic whine that vibrated in the bones. The Xylos operators went rigid, their networked awareness suddenly trapped within their own skulls. They were not dead, but their ability to influence the station, to signal for aid, to coordinate resistance, to even process the reality of the intrusion, was instantly nullified. They were paralyzed by informational isolation. "Junction secured," Hollow reported, his voice flat. "No kinetic engagement required. They are functionally inert, Commander. Their internal processes are cycling error reports based on lost synchronization." Kalen gripped the edge of the console. This was the true atrocity, the subtle violence that history would likely ignore in favor of bloodier skirmishes. To remove an entire species' capacity for self-determination without spilling a drop of blood on the target was a calculated cruelty far heavier than simple destruction. It was erasure of agency. "Maintain lockdown of all command personnel," Kalen ordered, his voice regaining a fraction of its natural depth, the strain easing only slightly as the mission parameters held true. "We are not here to execute the chorus. We are here to quarantine the threat." He looked to the starboard display, where the iron quill was now settling into the primary hangar bay, its utilitarian silhouette dwarfing the delicate Xylos docking infrastructure. The atmosphere in the bridge was thick with the smell of accumulated fatigue and the faintest trace of burnt insulation from the rapid power shifts. "Observer 7. Confirm status of the cerebral chorus in the primary containment dome. Status contained. The environment within the dome is now decoupled from the station's main power grid, running on localized monitored reserve cells. They are physically safe, Commander. Mentally, they are experiencing extreme systemic shock equivalent to total sensory deprivation combined with catastrophic data loss. Their expectation of discourse has been violently unmet." Kalen finally allowed himself a shallow breath. The lie he was living, the necessary deception, felt like a lead weight in his chest. Earth had sent him, the disgraced strategist, the man who argued against sending diplomats to the Thravex 3 decades prior, the man whose warnings about existential threats had been dismissed as paranoia. Now, he was here to prove paranoia justified. "Prepare the final transmission package," Kalen stated, turning away from the silent, crippled station outside. "Send the encrypted data stream to the chorus interface, the one we prepared on Veliska." Observer 7 processed the request, its synthesized voice unwavering. "Affirmative, Commander. Loading the doctrine of necessary preemption. Displaying transmission confirmation sequence." Kalen watched the holographic projection in the center of the bridge flicker. It was not a treaty, nor a demand for surrender. It was a single complex schematic, the complete internal power flow of Zoraz Station, now overlaid with vibrant red markers, showing every system placed under absolute human override. It was the ultimate assertion of control, delivered without argument, without the courtesy of a recognized greeting. The Xylos, who valued logic and communication above all else, were being shown a simple truth. Their logic was irrelevant when their systems were silenced. Kalen felt the phantom itch of his old command medal, the one he had been forced to surrender after the Veliska incident, the symbol of the trust humanity had placed in eloquence and the catastrophic failure that followed. He had not come here for a win. He had come for survival, purchased at the price of profound moral compromise. "When this is done," Kalen murmured, more to the ghosts in the metal than to his crew, "the chorus will understand. But the species that sent us here, will they understand the kind of entity we have just become in order to remain alive?" The projection pulsed, delivering the silent message into the heart of the trapped, silent Xylos' minds. The transmission was complete. The only sound now was the soft, steady click of the Iron Quill's environmental recyclers, working efficiently in the newly conquered, terrifying silence. Kalen stared at the schematic, knowing the galactic community would view this not as defense, but as the most audacious act of piracy in recorded history. He only hoped the cost of establishing this new, terrible peace would not be higher than the war they had just averted. The lingering ozone on the bridge was replaced by a faint, acrid smell of overheated relays, a stench that spoke less of battle and more of strained, unnatural endurance. Kalen Vane's hand, resting near the master override for the boarding party's environmental seals, twitched involuntarily, a minuscule tremor that his disciplined mind instantly suppressed, but which Observer 7, integrated deep into the ship's sensors, undoubtedly logged. The schematic of Zora's station, flashing its cold, damning red warnings, felt less like a victory marker and more like a massive, open wound on the tactical display. His victory, if the systematic disabling of a sovereign civilization could be called such a thing, was immediately complicated by a signal originating not from the Xylos core, but from the perimeter fleet established light years away by the fragile Earth High Council. The transmission was heavily encrypted, layered with protocol flags designed to bypass standard wartime jamming, but its source was unmistakable. Admiral Taran Lowen, Kalen's direct superior, and the very figure who had publicly sanctioned this preemptive strike while simultaneously demanding that Kalen maintain open diplomatic channels until the last possible second. "Commander Vane." The filtered voice of Lowen cut through the bridge's quiet, bearing the clipped, artificial calm of someone who had never smelled the recycled air of a besieged vessel. "Your incursion is confirmed within Zora's Sector Gamma. I require an immediate status update on the diplomatic exchange. Have the Xylos accepted the terms of the Second Annexation Compact?" Kalen straightened, the movement radiating an exhaustion that the ship's artificial lighting could not quite dispel. Lowen still believed in the fiction. She still operated under the assumption that Kalen, despite overwhelming evidence, had somehow managed to negotiate the terms of human subjugation into a trade agreement. It was the institutional blindness that had cost them Veliska. "Admiral Lowen," Kalen returned, his voice pitched low, ensuring the bridge crew, his small contingent of hardened veterans, understood the gravity of the exchange, but that the external comms were heavily filtered to mask the true nature of the situation. "The Iron Quill has achieved operational dominance over Zora's station. The expected delegates have not materialized. We encountered no armed resistance requiring kinetic deployment. A noticeable, sharp pause hung on the line, the lag of Lowen's processing unit struggling to reconcile Kalen's blunt data with her political narrative. "Commander, clarify operational dominance. Are you implying successful securement of the primary conference chamber for the scheduled signing?" Kalen rubbed the bridge of his nose, the action feeling clumsy against the smooth, hardened synth fiber of his glove. He knew Taran Lowen was not malicious. She was merely bound by the necessity of projecting an image of stability to a panicked civilian government. She needed a treaty, not a war crime. And Kalen had just committed the ultimate institutional betrayal, acting decisively without the mandated authorization of the consensus. "Admiral." The Xylo's cerebral chorus is currently contained within the primary dome. All primary communications and infrastructural processing nodes are under immediate human override. I repeat, Admiral, the Xylo's leadership is physically isolated and informationally blinded. We are not signing a compact. We are enforcing a unilateral disarmament. There is no diplomacy left, because there is no mutual capacity to conduct it. The response, when it came, was ice made manifest. Vane, you have violated standing orders for engagement and crossed the threshold of non-lethal intervention without authorization from the Council. Explain your rationale immediately, or I will initiate remote command lockout and court-martial proceedings upon your return. Explain the preemption. Kalen looked across the bridge to where the station map still glowed. Tavrin Hollow, his lead operative, was visible on a subsidiary monitor, his face pale beneath the harsh glow of a diagnostic panel inside a Xylo's control nexus. Hollow's eyes darted around the sterile alien chamber, not searching for an enemy, but for a vulnerability in the containment field Kalen himself had designed. My rationale is Veliska, Admiral, Kalen said, the memory flashing unbidden. The scent of burning nutrient paste mixed with the screams of non-combatants caught in the crossfire of hopeful, misjudged parley. He saw the reflection of the emergency lighting on the console, making the metal look wet. The Thravex delegation offered the same structural disarmament treaties we are now imposing. They spoke of mutual growth. When their fleet arrived a solar cycle later, they did not seek arbitration, they sought eradication. We waited then, Admiral. We debated for 3 weeks, while they positioned their siege engines. We lost 100 billion lives because we assumed civilization meant shared protocol. He paused, letting the weight of that history settle across the light years separating him from Lowen. I refuse to negotiate sovereignty with a species whose concept of peace is merely the lull between invasions. We took the initiative. We are wounded, Admiral, and we finally learned how to bite first. Lowen's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, the official veneer completely gone. You have initiated a systemic conflict that will rebound upon every human outpost within 3 sectors, Vane. The Chorus is not a singular military entity, it is a governance nexus. By paralyzing it, you have created a political vacuum that the peripheral Xylos sectors will perceive as an act of war, regardless of your intent to avoid kinetic exchange. This was the unexpected counterweight. Kalen had planned for military resistance. He had not fully accounted for the political inertia of a decentralized, though networked empire. He had silenced the brain, but the body was still massive, panicked, and capable of flailing violently. Observer 7, Kalen commanded, his focus snapping back to the immediate, tangible threat. Quantify immediate regional Xylos military response probability based on confirmed power disruption, assuming the local sectors interpret this as aggression. Probability of localized military mobilization within 72 standard hours. 91.4%. The unit reported instantly. The Xylos concept of hierarchical military command is distributed. While the Chorus is silenced, independent sector defense matrices will activate based on perceived systemic failure. They will assume sabotage by a rival power, not a diplomatic envoy. Kalen felt the cold settle deep into his bones, colder than the vacuum outside. He had traded one existential threat for a guaranteed series of smaller, immediate ones. The silence of the Chorus meant the threat of total annihilation was gone, but the threat of protracted, grinding resource wars across the periphery had just multiplied. Humanity had bought time, but at the cost of immediate galactic isolation. Admiral Lowen, Kalen said, injecting a hard, undeniable finality into his voice. The Council's mandate is irrelevant now. The Iron Quill has established control. Any attempt to remotely lock down our systems will be interpreted as a secondary hostile action by the Xylo's perimeter forces, who are already detecting station anomalies. If you try to take command, you guarantee the war we fought to avoid. My team remains in control until we can deploy a counter-narrative. That is my final determination. He cut the channel before Lowen could respond, the communication link dissolving into static that felt oddly comforting compared to the Admiral's sterile disapproval. The bridge crew looked at him, their faces a mixture of grim resolution and nascent fear. They were now criminals, renegades operating on the razor's edge of survival, cut off from the very civilization they sought to protect. "Hollow!" Kalen called out, turning to the monitor showing Tavrin's infiltration team. "The external threat is now political, not kinetic. We have bought us perhaps 3 standard days before the periphery fleets mobilize in earnest. We need to make a statement that cannot be misinterpreted as aggression, but as inescapable fact. Can you access the Xylos cultural archive within the data junction? I need something tangible, something that explains why we did this, intended for an audience less abstract than the chorus." Hollow nodded once, a grim confirmation. "The archive nodes are protected by layered conceptual encryption, Commander. Heavy on philosophical theory, light on tactical readouts. It will take time to synthesize a relevant counter-narrative, something beyond the schematic of dead systems, something that speaks to their own concept of order. Then you will use the time we have fought for," Kalen stated, looking out at the beautiful, paralyzed station. His decision had not brought peace. It had merely shifted the battleground from overt warfare to a desperate, silent campaign for understanding, waged from the heart of the enemy's silenced command center. The cost of survival, he realized with chilling certainty, was never just one moment of sacrifice. It was the permanent, grinding responsibility of living with the necessary cruelties enacted in the dark. The familiar, comforting click of the comms channel severing was immediately overlaid by a sharp, high-frequency whine that sliced through the bridge atmosphere, smelling sharply of ozone and burning insulation. It was the signature sound of a massive, unscheduled power surge originating from the station's primary reactor core, a system Kalen had explicitly isolated. "Observer 7, report. What is that resonant feedback?" Kalen demanded, dropping into the tactical chair, the lingering exhaustion replaced by a surge of adrenaline laced with metallic anxiety. "Incursion, detected within sub-level 5, reactor control," Observer 7 reported, its voice losing its synthesized flatness for the first time, suggesting genuine system overload. "It is not Xylos. The energy signature is chaotic. Utilizing thermal venting ports, the Xylos disabled during their last system recalibration cycle. This signature matches documented black box technology, unregistered human legacy hardware." Black box. The term conjured visions of desperate, untraceable human military relics, often repurposed by scavengers or rogue factions designed specifically to withstand systemic takeover and operate outside established command structures. Kalen had believed every known black box unit was accounted for, or long ago vaporized. If an unregistered unit was active inside the reactor core, it meant one of two things. Either a forgotten faction of hardliners had followed them, or someone on the perimeter, perhaps even Admiral Lowen, was using a desperate contingency plan that involved total destruction as an alternative to perceived compromise. "Hollow, abort archive retrieval. Divert immediately to sub-level 5 via secondary maintenance shaft Beta 9. Your objective is to neutralize the power spike and destroy the unauthorized unit. Do not engage the Xylos personnel nearby. They are now collateral to a secondary threat. Time to core breach." Tavrin Hollow's voice crackled over the dedicated channel, tight with immediate comprehension. "Commander, shaft Beta 9 is partially fused due to the cascade earlier. We will have to use shape charges on 3 bulkheads. Estimated time to junction, 35 minutes, assuming no further structural impediments. We have minimal ambient oxygen remaining in our packs. 35 minutes was an eternity when dealing with an unsecured reactor core, especially one designed by a species whose technology was based on principles humanity barely grasped. Kalen checked the primary reactor metrics on his console. The chaotic energy was beginning to bleed through the isolation barriers, causing localized system failures across the station, the very infrastructure he needed intact to enforce his tenuous peace. If the core went critical, the resulting explosion would vaporize Zoraz Station and the Iron Quill, leaving no trace of the intervention, and certainly no survivors to explain the nuanced political reality to the High Council. Hollow, you have 20 minutes. You will jettison all non-essential environmental gear to reduce mass. The Xylos personnel you encounter near the core are irrelevant to your primary objective. Use lethality only on the black box unit. Do you confirm? Confirmed, Commander. 20 minutes. Discarding environmental reserves now. The silence that followed Hollow's confirmation was the silence of imminent, localized crisis. The bridge crew shifted uneasily. They were prepared to subdue diplomats, not fight shadows utilizing forgotten human weaponry on an alien power plant. The air was getting heavier, thicker with the scent of hot metal and the electrical tang of stressed wiring. Kalen turned to Observer 7, the analytical unit now glowing with an unnerving intensity as it diverted all processing power to monitoring the reactor. 7. I need every joule of power you can shunt away from non-essential life support systems and into localized magnetic containment around the core. Can you stabilize the bleed? Negative, Commander. The uncontrolled surge is generating harmonic interference that prevents precise magnetic shaping. The containment field is degrading. Projection: 5 minutes until uncontrolled thermal runaway. The countdown had become terrifyingly short. Kalen knew he was facing the inevitable consequence of their unorthodox methods. The universe abhorred a vacuum, especially a political one, and now a rogue human element, likely guided by a deep-seated distrust of negotiation, a distrust Kalen himself shared, was attempting to enforce total destruction. Redirect life support power, Kalen ordered, his voice raspy, already feeling the shallow pull of the thinning atmosphere. Every available erg to the containment shunt. Divert power from the Quill's primary shielding reserves if necessary. I will accept external kinetic impact over internal detonation. Diverting shield reserves. 7 confirmed. Structural integrity projections dropping below 30% across the outer hull. Localized atmospheric pressure in sections 3 through 10 dropping rapidly. We are sacrificing external defense for internal stability. Kalen's personal environmental readout flashed an amber warning, ambient temperature climbing past comfortable tolerance, condensation beginning to form on the main viewport, where the station's frozen vacuum met the ship's rising internal heat. His own lungs felt tight. Then, a sudden, catastrophic event shook the Iron Quill violently. It wasn't the reactor. It was an external impact. The emergency lights flooded the bridge with blood-red illumination. Commander, unidentified vessel, small profile, entering high-speed orbit decay, not Xylos geometry. Signature matches Colonial Defense Fleet standard, a high-velocity insertion pod. 7 projected. It is targeting the primary hangar bay, our docking point. Kalen felt a profound, sickening lurch in his stomach. Admiral Lowen had not just threatened remote lockdown, she had dispatched a rapid response team, one likely equipped to neutralize Kalen's bridge crew and seize control of the station's systems by force. Regardless of the Xylos containment situation, they weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to execute Lowen's standing orders by force. He stared at the tactical map. Hollow was 22 minutes away from the reactor, fighting a ghost. Kalen was trapped between a rogue bomb inside the station and a hostile boarding party, locking down his only means of rapid extraction. Hollow, abandon the reactor neutralization, Kalen shouted into the comms. New priority, re-secure the Iron Quill. The infiltration team must breach the hangar bay from the inside before that insertion pod can cut us loose or disable our engines. The ship is our only bargaining chip. Commander, the reactor runaway probability is now at 75% within 4 minutes. We cannot leave the core unsecured, Hollow pleaded, his voice laced with desperation, the oxygen strain clearly audible. Kalen made the choice born of pure, unforgiving strategy. The reactor threat meant total annihilation, a final end. The loss of the Quill meant capture, interrogation, and the certainty that Lowen would use the prisoners to force humanity back into the dangerous diplomacy of the past. Survival, even under duress, was paramount. Hollow, I am locking down the core containment manually from here, using residual power, Kalen stated, though he knew it was a lie. The power was nearly gone. Your mission is the Quill. If we lose the ship, we lose all leverage against Lowen and the Council. Move! He slammed his hand down on the manual override for the reactor override sequence, sending a final, desperate surge of energy into the magnetic stabilizers. The bridge lights flickered, plunged into near-total darkness for a full second, then returned, weakly. The heat level dropped marginally, the system shuddering under the strain, but the core runaway projection stabilized at a manageable, though still critical, 60% chance of failure over the next hour. He had bought moments, not stability. The bridge crew immediately initiated counterboarding protocols, moving silently to secure internal choke points. The atmosphere was now thick with the metallic odor of sweat and the high-pitched whine of electrical systems fighting systemic overload. Kalen stared at the main viewport. The small, sharp insertion pod, clearly a specialized human military craft, was now only moments from impact with the hangar bay doors. He could make out the dark, reinforced silhouette against the distant stars. Observer 7, Kalen whispered, wiping a streak of sweat from his temple, the taste of it acrid and salty. Who is piloting that pod? Run a preemptive behavioral analysis based on Lowen's known contingencies. Observer 7's projection flickered violently, struggling against the ambient electrical interference. Analysis running. Commander, the pilot profile is not recognized within Council databases. The flight signature is erratic, employing kinetic evasion protocols far surpassing standard fleet parameters. This is not a standard dispatch unit. The insertion pod slammed into the Iron Quill's hangar structure. The entire ship bucked as if struck by a colossal hammer. Alarms wailed, actual kinetic impact alarms, loud and ugly. Commander, 7 reported, its voice fracturing under the strain. The insertion craft has breached the outer hangar door. It is not deploying troops. It is deploying a massive, single-frequency transmission beacon directly into the Quill's external systems. It is attempting to broadcast a single signal, unimpeded by jamming, directly into the station's core network, the one we just stabilized. Kalen understood instantly. If the rogue element couldn't destroy the station, they would use the chaos to broadcast a message directly to the periphery Xylos sectors, one calculated to override Kalen's slow, complex political explanation with raw, inflammatory narrative, a narrative designed to ignite the sector defense matrices into immediate, full-scale war against the human presence, cementing Kalen's reputation as the instigator of interstellar conflict. The beacon was counting down, its signal strengthening against the crippled containment field. Estimated broadcast completion, 90 seconds. If that signal transmits, the periphery fleets mobilize instantly. We will be surrounded by hostile forces before Hollow can even exit the reactor shaft. Kalen looked at his crew, his face grim in the emergency lights. The survival game had just escalated from a fight for control to a desperate race against ideological warfare. We cannot let that signal complete. We must disable the external beacon now, even if it means venting the remaining internal pressure directly into space. The cessation of that high-pitched electronic scream, a sound so corrosive it seemed to strip the very paint from the bulkheads, was replaced by an absolute, suffocating coldness that seeped from the environmental controls. Kalen could feel the change immediately. The system, starved of life support power to feed the containment field, had locked into a severe, energy-saving deep cycle, dropping the internal temperature by 12 degrees standard within moments. The metallic tang of sweat turned sharp, then faded, replaced by the sterile chill of recycled air fighting to remain breathable. This was the price of buying hollow time against the rogue black box. Every comfort, every redundancy was stripped away, leaving the bridge crew shivering in their functional but thin synth fiber uniforms. "Beacon countdown." Kalen forced the words out, his breath misting slightly before the inadequate ventilation system could snatch it away. He ignored the internal threat for a micro-moment, focusing solely on the insertion pod hammering at the hangar. 78 seconds remaining for full broadcast integrity. Observer 7 reported, its internal monitoring systems prioritizing the external threat over the failing reactor stability. The Colonial Defense Insertion Pod is broadcasting a high-yield, wide-spectrum message. It is bypassing standard filtering by utilizing a frequency modulation wave that mimics Xylo's distress signals, a calculated act of profound misdirection. Kalen didn't need Seven's analysis to understand the implication. Admiral Lowen's rapid response wasn't a rescue mission. It was a sabotage operation aimed at ensuring Kalen's calculated piece failed before it could be explained. The military establishment preferred the clear, justifiable enemy, the Xylos, over the ambiguous, terrifying reality of human preemptive action. "Hollow status report on the Quill breach," Kalen demanded, bracing himself against the vibration traveling up the deck plating from the hangar impact. "We're through the secondary maintenance hatch into Bay 1, Commander. 2 members of the boarding party are already applying breaching charges to the interior hangar lock. The enemy pod has ruptured the outer seal, but the internal bay door is holding due to emergency locking protocols," Hollow reported. His voice was now strained, the lack of oxygen clearly affecting his reaction time, but his resolve remained granite hard. "We will secure the ship in 30 seconds. But, Commander, if that external signal transmits, we're trapped between the Xylos military and Lowen's fleet." 30 seconds. That was less time than the beacon needed to complete its lethal transmission. The cold was making Kalen's focus brittle, threatening to shatter the careful calculus he had maintained for days. He looked at the schematic of the station, no longer seeing a complex puzzle, but a tomb where he had managed to seal himself in with his allies, while the true executioners were closing the door from the outside. The realization hit him with the force of the impact that rattled the Quill. He had focused entirely on the intent of the threat, the Xylo's latent aggression, the internal black box trying to trigger total war. He had missed the structural weakness inherent in his own gambit. By severing the cerebral chorus, he had created a void. And into that void, the most cynical, politically motivated elements of the human council had inserted their own poison. They didn't fear the Xylos as much as they feared Kalen succeeding where diplomacy had failed. A successful preemptive strike proved that centralized, consensual governance was too slow to handle existential threats. The chill on the bridge seemed to deepen, becoming bone-aching, a physical manifestation of this new, political coldness. Kalen scrolled through the diagnostic logs for the black box unit currently destabilizing the reactor. He didn't need to see the physical hardware. He needed the data bleed, the information that the rogue unit was trying to transmit. 7. Ignore the external beacon for 1 second. Cross-reference the black box transmission signature with known colonial defense data leaks from the Valiska period. I want to know what specific message that rogue unit is sending to the reactor core. 7 paused for a measurable 3 seconds, an eternity in deep operations, before responding. The holographic representation of the station seemed to momentarily waver. Commander, the black box signal is not designed to trigger a meltdown. It is designed to achieve informational synchronization with the Xylo's core network before broadcast. The message is an override key. An override key for what? Kalen pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For the isolation protocols, the black box unit is attempting to unseal the cerebral chorus containment dome from the inside, 7 stated. The rogue element is not trying to incite war via the periphery fleet. They are trying to free the Xylo's high command, believing that only a full-scale military engagement will purge the Council of its weakness. The revelation was staggering, a complete inversion of the known tactical reality. Kalen wasn't fighting a faction seeking human destruction. He was fighting a faction seeking total, unmitigated war against the Xylos, believing that only mass conflict could reset humanity's political trajectory. They were using the chaos to unleash the very existential threat Kalen had risked everything to neutralize. The cold horror of the political entanglement settled over him. He was trapped between the Xylos, who believed he was a warmonger, and the human zealots, who believed he was a traitor for showing restraint. Hollow, scratch the ship recovery, Kalen cut in, his decision instant and final, driven by the immediate primary threat to the galaxy, the unconstrained chorus. The reactor threat is secondary now. If the chorus is freed, the peripheral fleets will mobilize anyway, but they will do so under the direction of a sentient, enraged intelligence, not panicked defense matrices. Priority Alpha, Sublevel 5. Neutralize the black box before it completes synchronization. Use maximum yield on the explosive charge if necessary. Self-preservation is irrelevant if the chorus is loose. Commander, that puts us in direct conflict with the insertion pod's objective. If we engage the black box, we guarantee the beacon finishes its broadcast unimpeded. Hollow protested, the desperation clear in his voice. He understood the dilemma. Save the ship and risk the entire Xylo civilization, or save the galaxy and surrender their only escape route to Lowen's enforcement team. Kalen stared at the countdown clock for the external beacon. 55 seconds. He looked at the reactor stability projection, 60% chance of runaway in less than 3 minutes if he redirected power back from the containment field to deal with the hangar. He had no time for subtlety, no path that preserved both the ship and the peace. 7. Reroute all remaining shield power, what little we have left, to the magnetic containment field around the core, then immediately cut life support power entirely. Full drain, by Hollow 60 seconds at maximum exertion. I will manually overload the Quill's primary drive coupling, a localized, non-propagating energy surge, and fire it as a kinetic projectile into the insertion pod. It will disable the beacon, but the feedback will fry every system on the bridge, including comms and life support backup. We buy Hollow 60 seconds, and we destroy Lowen's hand. It was the ultimate sacrifice of the lever of control. They would be trapped, defenseless, inside a compromised station, awaiting Hollow's success against the black box, while the reactor teetered on the edge of critical failure. But it was the only way to remove the immediate political fuse, the beacon, while giving Hollow the necessary window to defuse the existential bomb. Commander, This action guarantees systemic failure across the quill and removes all possibility of remote command takeover, but the resulting electromagnetic pulse will effectively render our bridge systems inert, isolating us completely. Furthermore, the drive surge will generate a massive heat bloom inside the hangar, likely incinerating the boarding party upon completion. 7 calculated with brutal accuracy. The boarding party understands the stakes, 7. They jettisoned their oxygen reserves for speed. Their mission is the threat inside, not the recovery of the vessel. Prepare the drive coupling discharge sequence. 5 seconds to ignition countdown for the pulse. Kalen felt a profound, icy resignation. He was choosing the morally ambiguous path of immediate self-destruction to prevent a political catastrophe that would guarantee long-term galactic ruin. He was sacrificing the immediate safety of his last loyal operatives to buy time for the alien minds he had just disarmed. 3 seconds, Kalen muttered, his fingers hovering over the final sequence confirmation, the air thinning rapidly, the cold biting deep. He looked at the blinking red threat markers across the holographic map, the rogue black box, the looming reactor threat, and now the incoming boarding team from Lowen preparing to seize their disabled vessel. The survival of humanity would not be judged by its eloquence or its strength, but by the cold mathematics of its final, necessary compromises. 2, 1. Discharge. Kalen slammed the confirmation. The ship did not explode outwards. Instead, an intense, blindingly white light erupted from the main drive housing, channeled directly out through the ruptured hangar bay. A colossal surge of pure energy, precisely aimed, slammed into the small insertion pod. The pod vaporized instantly, its beacon transmissions sputtering into nothingness, the external threat neutralized in a flash of overwhelming kinetic feedback. The resulting electromagnetic waves slammed back into the ion quill. Every light on the bridge died instantly. The heavy, suffocating cold returned, complete and immediate. Kalen's vision tunneled to black, the last sensation being the agonizing pressure in his chest as the emergency life support flickered, failed, and offered no reserve power at all. The only sound left was the deep, menacing thrum of the unstable reactor core, now stabilized at an agonizing 60% chance of runaway, with the man sent to stop it, isolated and suffocating in the sudden, profound dark. When the light died, the crushing pressure on Kalen's sternum was not just atmospheric, it was the full, leaden weight of absolute failure. The silence that followed the electromagnetic discharge was worse than the scream of the beacon. It was the silence of a coffin ceiling. He was conscious, profoundly so, aware of the agonizing slowness of his own breath. Each inhalation, a deliberate, conscious act of scavenging the last vestiges of recycled, chilled air. His vision remained a dense, absolute void, broken only by the faintest, residual phosphorescent glow clinging to the edges of the main console screen. A ghost image of the station schematic he had just sacrificed his leverage to protect. He reached out a hand, feeling only the cold, unforgiving synth fiber of his uniform pressing against skin that felt suddenly ancient and brittle. He could hear the shallow, rasping breaths of the 2 remaining bridge technicians near the rear bulkhead, Operator 5 and Navigator Jin. But their movements were slow, sluggish echoes of their former efficiency. They were suffering the same oxygen deprivation, the same systemic shock, but Kalen felt it magnified, a direct consequence of holding the manual discharge trigger for those final, critical seconds. The cold was more than physical. It was the chilling recognition that he had just traded the possibility of political recovery for a mere technical advantage. He had destroyed the Council's tool of coercion, Lowen's enforcer pod, but in doing so, he had also destroyed his own means of communication, his redundancy systems, and his primary tether to any semblance of justifiable authority. He was no longer a strategic commander. He was a shipwrecked sailor in an alien sea, clinging to wreckage. 30 seconds. That was the window Seven had calculated for Hollow to reach the black box unit before the containment field collapsed entirely. But now, with all auxiliary power diverted to the failing magnetic shunt, Kalen had no way to monitor Hollow, no way to confirm the containment success, and no way to warn him if the reactor destabilized beyond the 60% projection. He clawed his way upright, his muscles protesting with sharp, burning spasms, the physical toll of extreme exertion under duress. He could feel the dull, rhythmic ache where his old shrapnel wound often flared, now exacerbated by the cold and the near anoxia. He leaned against the console, using the cold metal for support. Observer 7, Kalen managed, the word emerging as a strained croak. Report on system status. Prioritize internal monitoring. Life support integrity. There was no immediate response. The silence persisted, thick and complete. The quill, built for war and hardened against kinetic shock, was now crippled internally by its own desperate defense. The electromagnetic pulse from the drive discharge had clearly scrubbed the delicate analytical matrix of the AI core, or perhaps simply starved it of the minimal power it needed to maintain active processing. Kalen pressed his face against the dark console screen, trying to force his eyes to perceive any residual energy signature, any glimmer of diagnostic data. Nothing. Seven was gone, or functionally dormant. An isolation far more terrifying than the Xylo's enforced silence. Seven was the objective voice of logic, the keeper of the data. Without it, Kalen was navigating solely by memory and instinct, the tools that had failed them at Veliska. The deeper thrum of the reactor, however, was undeniable. It was no longer a stable, menacing vibration. It was irregular, punctuated by momentary spikes that felt like internal tremors in the station's colossal frame. The 60% chance of runaway was likely now a certainty ticking down in the dark. He stumbled toward the airlock controls, an instinctual move toward external environment checks, though he knew the cold would consume him instantly without a suit. He reached the auxiliary manual release, a heavy, physical lever designed for catastrophic failure scenarios. As his numbed fingers found the cold steel, a memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. His daughter, years ago before the long deployment, asking why he spent so much time studying ancient tactical failures. He had told her, "Because, child, if you do not understand the exact mechanism of your last defeat, you will design the same one for your descendants." He realized, with a sickening clarity that eclipsed the physical cold, that he had designed the same defeat. He had feared the Xylos, then he had feared Admiral Lowen's political maneuvering, and in mitigating those external threats, he had entirely failed to secure his own tactical foundation. He had sacrificed his intelligence network, Seven, to buy time for his ground team, Hollow, against a threat they hadn't even fully understood, the Zealots, trying to free the Xylos. It was a triage decision made in desperation, and now, isolated in the dark, he could not verify if Hollow had succeeded or if he was currently suffocating, fighting a ghost in a ventilation shaft, while the real threat, the chorus, was potentially stirring in the deep core. If Hollow had failed, the Xylo's leadership would awaken to find their communications severed, their base compromised, and a black box signal echoing in their central node, likely interpreted as a final, brutal assault. They would not negotiate. They would burn the quadrant to ash. Kalen sank to the deck plating, the impact jarring his already aching body. The weight of the Citadel, the weight of every misplaced faith in civilized conduct, pressed down on him. He had brought humanity to the brink of a new path, a path of pragmatic self-preservation. But his first steps on that path had been so swift, so steeped in necessary violence, that he had immediately collided with the next, more dangerous form of human fanaticism. He was not the architect of a future peace. He was the catalyst for the next great war, the one born of fear and counter-fear. He closed his eyes, trying to force a calm focus that his exhausted, freezing body refused to allow. He had to find a way to confirm Hollow's status, or fail, knowing he had abandoned the only operative still capable of securing the core. Then, a sound. Not the deep, ominous thrum of the reactor, but a delicate alien sound filtering through the dead comms channels, a rapid, almost insectile tapping, high frequency and rhythmic, coming from the main viewport area. It was the sound of something small, hard, and metallic striking the reinforced plasteel hull of the iron quill. It wasn't Xylo's technology. It was too erratic, too precise in its broken rhythm. Kalen pushed himself up again, his limbs moving with the terrifying sluggishness of a man fighting his own nervous system. He shuffled toward the main viewer, wiping the condensation away with the sleeve of his uniform. In the dim, residual glow reflecting from the silent station dome, he could make out a small, insect-like drone clinging to the exterior viewport, no larger than his hand. It was utilizing focused sonic emitters to map the internal damage, its movements frantic and intelligent. It was a Xylo's reconnaissance unit, the kind designed for geological survey, now deployed for damage assessment. And it was tapping a pattern. Kalen stopped breathing entirely. He recognized the sequence immediately, not from any official military protocol, but from the deepest, most protected archival files of the Velisca incident. A non-standard, emergency cipher used by select human intelligence units operating deep behind enemy lines. A system designed to transmit operational status using rhythmic light or sound signatures when all comms failed. It was a ghost protocol meant to be retired decades ago. The tapping repeated, short, short, long, short, short, long, long, short, short. It was the confirmation code for objective secured, extraction required. Hollow had succeeded against the black box unit, and the reactor was stable, or at least the stabilization effort was successful enough for the Xylos to risk sending a probe to assess the threat they had just narrowly avoided. Relief was a physical wave, immediately followed by a crushing wave of new, cold reality. Hollow was alive, but he was now trapped inside a dead ship, 3 sub-levels away from the core, and the Xylos knew the breach originated from the iron quill. The enemy was waking up, and they knew exactly where the primary saboteur was located. Kalen shuffled back to the manual override panel for the auxiliary life support, the one circuit he had deliberately left untouched, believing it too risky to divert power from the reactor shunt. If he could restore just enough localized power to the bridge, he could potentially override the magnetic lock on the inner bridge door, allowing Hollow access to the command center as a sanctuary. He found the heavy, guarded toggle switch, his frozen fingers fumbling blindly in the darkness. He had to risk everything, rerouting the last sliver of core containment power, the power holding the unstable reactor back, into the life support cycle, just for a few precious minutes. It was a suicidal gamble, betting the entire sector against the few minutes of oxygen needed for Hollow to reach him. He found the switch. As his hand closed around the cold metal, the tapping on the viewport outside changed abruptly. The rhythmic code ceased, replaced by a frantic, continuous hammering, and the small drone suddenly oriented itself directly toward the bridge's interior. The Xylo's reconnaissance unit had detected the residual heat signature of Kalen's body mass and the faint flicker of power draw as he reached for the life support switch. They had found their intruder. Kalen pulled the lever down with a grunt of effort. The bridge systems shrieked as power violently redirected. The lights did not come on. Instead, the main environmental display panel erupted in a silent, brilliant cascade of amber failure alerts, warnings that the containment field around the reactor had just dropped precipitously. Simultaneously, a new, Piercing alarm blared through the external hull speakers, a sound the Xylos used for massive structural breaches, a sound that meant the station itself was preparing to vent sections to space. The Xylos had detected the intrusion on the Quill and were initiating emergency sterilization of the hostile vessel, sealing the hangar bay and preparing to cycle the atmosphere out to hard vacuum to cleanse the saboteurs. Kalen was trapped in the dark, freezing command center, having traded one immediate executioner for 3 simultaneous crushing threats. His last act of strategic control had only bought him the time to trigger his own destruction, with the only potentially surviving ally now racing toward a command center that was moments away from becoming a pressurized tomb, venting into space. He could feel the hull beginning to depressurize, the air growing thin and sharp against his skin, the deep thrum of the reactor escalating into a strained, violent roar that promised annihilation from within or vacuum from without. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The pull of the auxiliary lever was not heroic. It was a spasm of desperation, the final, desperate act of a man overriding a superior system with brute, primitive mechanics. As Kalen wrenched the power shunt home, the iron quill reacted like a dying animal spasming. A storm of electrical fire erupted across the main console, searing the air with the smell of vaporized copper and ozone, the one scent he had sworn never to associate with command again. The amber failure alerts on the environmental panel did not just flash. They merged into a solid, blinding stripe of warning. The diagnostic readouts, ghost images moments before, now pulsed with catastrophic data. Reactor containment field integrity, 10%. Station sterilization sequence, confirmed. Hangar bay seals, initiating lockdown, estimated 30 seconds to full vacuum cycle in docking bay alpha. Kalen ignored the fire licking at the wiring beside his elbow. He forced his focus onto the internal bridge door controls. The magnetic locks, controlled by the station's master system, were resisting the sudden surge of power from the Quill, but they were fighting a losing battle against Kalen's crude, centralized rerouting. He watched the tiny LED indicators beside the thick plasteel seals. Red, 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 and then, with a screech of stressed metal that echoed the pain in his own bones, the first lock sputtered and turned amber, then green. "Jin! Operator 5! Access to Central Bridge! Move!" Kalen roared, the sound tearing at his dry throat. The technicians, galvanized by the immediate threat of explosive decompression, scrambled toward the opening, their movements regaining a fraction of their trained speed, fueled by terror rather than discipline. They tumbled through the gap just as the second magnetic seal failed with a heavy, percussive thud. Kalen, rooted to the spot by the need to monitor the reactor's death throes, saw the environmental display flicker again. The external drone hammering on the viewport was still there, its sonic emissions intensifying, clearly registering the catastrophic power fluctuations aboard the Quill. The Xylos had determined the ship was the epicenter of the failure and were prioritizing its destruction. The emergency override on the reactor was failing faster than projected. Kalen could feel the ship's very structure beginning to vibrate at a frequency too low for sound. A deep, menacing resonance that promised structural disassembly. He had bought Hollow maybe 15 seconds of clear air to reach the bridge, but he had guaranteed the Quill would be scoured from existence in the next 60. Then, a shadow fell across the chaotic amber lights of the console. Tavern Hollow stood framed in the momentarily open doorway, not sprinting, but moving with a frighteningly economical gait, his tactical suit scorched in several places, his face obscured by the darkened visor of his helmet. He carried the heavy, encrypted data module, the black box, clutched in one armored hand. Hollow did not speak. He merely strode past the two technicians huddled near the rear bulkhead and stopped directly in front of Kalen. He didn't acknowledge the fire or the alarm. His focus was entirely on the commander. "Commander." Hollow's voice, amplified and distorted through his helmet comms, cut through the noise, sounding like grinding stone. "Black box secured. Core neutralization successful. The chorus is inert, but their secondary security lattice is activating. They are shifting control to local defense protocols. Drones. They are reacting to the power drain." "Vacuum cycle initiated on the hangar," Kalen grated out, his breath catching in his chest as the air grew perceptibly thinner. "We have minutes before the quill is vented. Get to the escape pods. Use the emergency maintenance override on Bay 2. It's shielded against the main cycle." "Mum!" Hollow shifted the data module from one hand to the other, a subtle gesture that Kalen recognized as deep-seated deliberation. "Negative, Commander. The pods are on station power only. The Xylos are cycling a magnetic surge to burn out any localized energy signatures after the vacuum purge. The pods will cook on launch sequence. We need a hard jump." "There is no hard jump, Tavern," Kalen hissed, forcing himself to meet the helmet's blank stare. "The drive core is cycling to critical mass. We overload the jump capacitor here. We take half this station with us. We jettison the core, then we use the kinetic thrusters for a blind burn on emergency power." "And leave the black box here?" Hollow countered, his tone devoid of challenge, purely tactical. "The political council needs the proof of the chorus's capacity for preemptive violence. We deliver the package, or the council denies everything and sends the diplomats back next cycle. We follow the original mandate, Commander. Delivery." Kalen looked at the reactor readings, 9% integrity, and then at Hollow, holding the only leverage humanity possessed in this entire sector. Hollow was right, in the horrifying, cold logic of survival politics. Deliver the evidence, or the cost of this terrible action would be erased by political expediency back home. "The quill is dead," Kalen stated, the realization settling like ice in his lungs. "We can't jettison the core and maintain life support for the burn. Not without 7 to manage the energy distribution." The drone outside, sensing the brief stabilization of power, began to fire microcharges against the viewport, not kinetic rounds, but focused energy bursts designed to crack the plasteel and then vent the interior. The viewport began to spiderweb with hairline fractures, illuminated momentarily by the flare of each impact. Hollow stepped closer, leaning in until his helmet almost touched Kalen's face. "I have the schematics for the magnetic shunt override. I can reroute the reactor's final kinetic bleed-off into a single directed pulse, Commander. A pulse aimed at the drone swarm attempting to clear the bay." He tapped the black box. "It buys us 3 minutes of clear exit path if we run through the primary maintenance shafts to the auxiliary shuttle cradle. It's not a clean escape, but it's an escape. It vents the last of our stable power into one useless burst against a drone swarm, Tavern," Kalen argued, his voice cracking with fatigue. "It doesn't buy us time. It buys us a better view of the vacuum cycling in." "It buys you time, Commander," Hollow corrected him, finally introducing the personal cost. "You are wounded, compromised by the EMP residue. Operator 5 and Jin are unfit for sustained exertion. I am operational. You secure the data module. You are the sole surviving chain of command, and you get it to the rendezvous point. I will manually initiate the shunt bleed from the junction access point near the core. It will stabilize the quill just long enough to buy you transit time through the shafts, and the drone swarm will be temporarily disabled by the focused feedback." Kalen stared at the data module in Hollow's hand. He understood. Hollow was not requesting permission. He was delivering a final operational report and taking the most dangerous remaining position. He was trading his own viable escape for Kalen's ability to survive and deliver the proof of necessity. It was not heroism. It was the cold, strategic sacrifice of the fittest operative for the continuity of command. Tavern, the core integrity is at 7%. If you initiate that shunt manually, you will be within the primary radiation field when it bleeds off. You won't have time to retreat before the residual flux spikes. Hollow's helmet tilted slightly, a gesture of final acknowledgement. Understood, Commander. The cost is acceptable for the successful execution of the primary directive. Give the order. Kalen felt the old, familiar paralysis of command, the impossible choice where every option led to loss. He had failed to bring diplomats. He had brought assassins. Now one of them was offering himself as a shield against the ensuing political fallout. "Hollow," Kalen said, his voice steadying, the training asserting itself over the exhaustion. "Execute the shunt override at coordinate Delta 99. Once completed, you have 60 seconds to reach maintenance hatch Gamma 4. I will cycle the localized environmental regulators in that sector to minimal oxygen recycling only. You will have a window to extract yourself via the auxiliary conduit leading to the surface access." Hollow nodded once, decisively. He transferred the black box, the entire future political justification of their violence, into Kalen's trembling grip. "The data is secure, Commander. Survive." Then, Tavern Hollow turned, his tactical suit a deep, impenetrable black against the frantic amber strobing of the failing systems, and moved with ruthless purpose toward the aft section of the bridge, toward the reactor housing. Operator 5 and Jin, sensing the imminent vacuum cycle and the last sliver of stable air being diverted to the core sector, pressed themselves against the far bulkhead, eyes fixed on Kalen, waiting for the new, final order. Kalen Vane stood alone in the center of the chaos, clutching the cold, hard evidence of necessary brutality. The reactor thrum accelerated into a deafening, grinding whine, the sound of ultimate kinetic release being manually compressed. He watched the access panel for the aft section hiss shut, sealing Hollow inside the heart of the dying ship. He had mere seconds before the Xylo's external systems fried the quill, before the vacuum cycle finished, and before the radiation pulse from Hollow's sacrifice washed over the surviving bridge crew. He looked at the schematic on the dying screen, the simple map that showed the station systems now under their control, and he understood the chilling truth. Peace was not the absence of war. It was the temporary, absolute subjugation of one species' will by another. "Jin, Operator 5, Kalen ordered, his voice ringing with a new, terrible authority born of irreversible action. "Follow me. Maintain absolute silence. We move through the maintenance network. The Xylos think they are fighting a warship. They are wrong. They are fighting ghosts." He turned toward the emergency maintenance hatch, the path Hollow had cleared, ignoring the violent shriek of the hull as the Xylos drone swarm finally succeeded in cracking the primary viewport, a high-pitched, metallic groan signaling the beginning of the catastrophic breach. The air, already thin, tasted like static and scorched metal as Kalen plunged into the darkness of the conduit, the future of his species resting heavily in his numb, reluctant hand. The noise did not stop instantly. That was the first, most profound lie that the ancient, simplistic tactical fiction always perpetuated. There was no immediate, clean snap to silence. Instead, there was a slow, viscous draining of sound, a decaying resonance that left the survivors adrift in a suddenly pressurized void. Kalen felt the frantic thrum of the reactor, Hollow's final act, not through his ears, which were ringing from the viewport impacts, but through the soles of his combat boots, a dying heartbeat that pulsed 3 more times before fading into a low, heavy shudder. Then nothing but the hiss of failing life support. The vacuum cycle in the hangar bay, having completed its first stage, ceased its immediate suction as the auxiliary regulators diverted the residual power surge to seal the main breaches. The 3 figures remaining on the bridge, Kalen, Jin, and Operator 5, were enveloped in a sudden heavy quiet, broken only by their own ragged, shallow inhalations. The air was thin, metallic, and cold, smelling faintly of burnt circuitry and the acrid tang of ionized plasma residue. The viewport was no longer transparent. It was a complex lacework of fractured plasteel. A shattered eye staring blankly into the crippled geodesic dome of Zora's station. Kalen waited, counting the regulated heartbeats of the environmental recycler that Observer 7 had managed to salvage before its primary processing unit had been overloaded by the core shutdown. 5 breaths. 10. The silence was not peace. It was the pause between 2 catastrophic events. Status report, Kalen managed, the words tasting dusty. Jin, the younger engineer, was slumped against the rear bulkhead, tracing invisible lines on the cooling metal with a gloved finger. He did not look up. Hull integrity fluctuating between 62 and 68% across the primary spine. We are structurally compromised but stable. Life support holding at 50% efficiency using salvaged auxiliary cells, the drone swarm. They are inactive, Commander. The kinetic feedback pulse achieved neutralization on external contact points within a 1-kilometer radius. Operator 5, always the most detached, was already moving toward the emergency conduit hatch. He checked the seals manually, his face a mask of exhaustion beneath his helmet visor. The black box, the package, is secure on Commander Vane. We proceed according to the last operational directive. Extraction via auxiliary cradle. Holloway's sacrifice has given us the necessary window. Kalen looked down at the module in his hand. It was denser than it looked. A mundane piece of technology carrying the weight of a newly defined galactic precedent. He had sent diplomats to die hoping for dialogue. He had sent soldiers to silence a threat. And in doing so, he had created an artifact of unanswerable aggression. Hollow hadn't died gloriously. He had performed a meticulous act of calculated, necessary self-immolation to ensure the political fallout back home would be manageable, that the Council would have the empirical data to justify the unilateral disarming of a potentially hostile entity before they could escalate. He remembered the initial observation from Part 1, the metallic thick air, the waiting. Now the air was just cold and thin. The anticipation was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-weary understanding of the mechanisms required to keep a species alive. "We move," Kalen ordered, pushing himself away from the console that was now useless, scarred by the very desperation that had saved them. He did not look at the charred remains of the command station where Hollow had last stood. There would be no ceremony, no reflection permitted. To linger was to invite the Xylo's remnants to re-establish localized control, or worse, to invite the slower, more bureaucratic scrutiny of their own political superiors who had only authorized the diplomatic probe. The journey through the maintenance conduits was a study in claustrophobia and creeping cold. They moved single file, their helmet lamps cutting weak cones through the thick dust that had settled when the station systems died. This was not the environment for the glorious charge. This was the grim reality of war. Scraping through conduits, smelling of overheated lubricants and decay, moving away from the sudden, violent light show of the primary breach. They bypassed the main reactor housing entirely. Kalen imagined the silent core, its energy bled out into a final protective wave, and Hollow sealed inside that metallic tomb. No cry escaping the vacuum, no plea registered by the very chorus he had silenced. It was the perfect military silence. Clean, efficient, and morally ruinous for those who survived to witness it. When they finally reached the auxiliary cradle access point, the small, shielded bay designed for emergency supply shuttles, Kalen ordered the environmental systems to equalize to minimal atmospheric pressure, just enough to prevent rapid bodily failure during the extraction. Jin and Operator 5 worked in practiced synchronicity, their exhaustion masked by sheer professional momentum. The shuttle itself was Spartan, a utility sled designed for short-range deployment, powered by independent fusion cells. The exact system Hollow had warned Kalen about regarding magnetic frying. "Commander," Operator 5 said, his voice tight over the comms, "I am initializing the pre-jump sequence now. We have minimal shielding against Xylo's sensor sweep, but if we jump immediately, we might slip into the acoustic shadow of the ruined sector." Kalen paused at the shuttle ramp. He looked back toward the main body of Zoraz Station, now a massive silent piece of wreckage floating amidst the debris field. It was not destroyed, it was neutralized, held in a state of perpetual, agonizing confusion by the black box he carried. Humanity had not won a battle. They had performed a forced lobotomy on an entire civilization that had expected a handshake. He thought back to the thick, metallic air of the Quills Bridge when they had first entered this restricted zone, the air saturated with tension and the faint, stale odor of suppressed exertion. That tension had been a premonition. Now the air was cold, thin, and carried the absolute certainty of what they had become. Kalen stepped onto the shuttle ramp. He did not look at Jin or Operator 5. They were tools, surviving components of the necessary demolition. "Initiate the blind burn," Kalen commanded, settling into the pilot's chair, the black box secured in its magnetic cradle beside him. "Set coordinates for the fringe relay point. No deviation. No contact." The shuttle's fusion cells roared to life, a harsh, grating sound that drowned out the remnants of the alarms. There was no grand moment of departure, no triumphant acceleration. Just the shuddering violence of a forced exit, the small vessel tearing itself away from the immense, crippled mass of the station. As the shuttle clawed its way toward the jump coordinates, Kalen keyed a final transmission protocol, a broadcast loop addressed only to the highest levels of the Council, a message that would not be deciphered until they were safely within established territory, a message designed to preempt any charges of atrocity leveled against him. He closed his eyes as the jump sequence initiated, the hull groaning under the strain of the blind vector acquisition. He could still feel the phantom sensation of the console plating under his own white knuckles from the opening moments of the mission, the desperate grip against the tide of expectation. Now, there was only the smooth, overwhelming sensation of the drive spooling up, the promise of transit away from the scene of the necessary crime. Kalen looked out the small forward viewport as the stars began to smear into white lines of impossible speed, leaving the Xylo system behind, a silent testament to the fragility of faith in first contact. The silence that followed was vast, cold, and absolute, the weight of command finally settling into the cold dread of survival. He had kept the evidence, but he had lost the right to call himself diplomatic. He had kept the breath in his lungs, but the metallic air he tasted now was the taste of irreversible decision. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.